Todo mundo já se deparou com o problema do sofrimento. Não tem uma pessoa que não tenha sofrido na vida. E muitos de nós que acreditamos em Deus ficamos com aquela pergunta: se Deus é todo poderoso, se Ele é todo amoroso, por que o mal existe? Por que a gente tem que conviver com essa realidade, sendo que Deus poderia resolver todos os nossos problemas e simplesmente, puf, fazer o mal sumir? Por que Ele não resolve nossos problemas? Qual é o problema de Deus com o problema do sofrimento e da nossa dor? Então eu quero deixar para vocês nesse sábado uma reflexão sensacional do matemático de Oxford, John Lennox. Eu já coloquei um outro vídeo dele aqui no meu canal, mas este é muito especial porque ele estava lá onde aconteceu o 11 de setembro, na queda das Torres Gêmeas, falando para as famílias que foram afetadas. Eu traduzi e legendei este vídeo alguns anos atrás e eu quero que ele sirva a você para que você sofra um pouco menos e compreenda a razão do seu sofrimento e como isso se relaciona de algum modo com a existência de Deus, com a existência, obviamente, do Deus que nós acreditamos ser o único e verdadeiro, o Pai de nosso Senhor Jesus Cristo. Então, fique com este vídeo, aproveite e tente ajudar outras pessoas com aquilo que você aprendeu.
Thank you very much for that welcome. I feel looking around me that I've arrived in Athens. And that makes me feel very comfortable because of the Greeks and their fascination with science. You've asked me to speak to you on the question that I find the hardest of all. Each one of us, whatever his or her worldview, finds the problem of pain and suffering and evil an extremely difficult one. And I do not want you to think at the outset that I feel that I've got a set of simplistic answers. What I wish to share with you are ways in which I approach this question that I have found increasingly helpful in my life. You will realize, of course, that the problem of suffering and evil has two sides. Cancer looks like one thing through the eyes of the oncologist. It looks very different through the eyes of the young woman of 25 who's just been told that she has a few months to live. There is an intellectual side to the question because our minds want reason and meaning. There is also a pastoral side to the question because many of us may well be hurting and we have questions that go beyond our human resource to cope with. So I'm going to try to do what is really impossible and difficult tonight, is to combine both of those sides. And you will forgive me if I don't go into much detail, but I hope it will begin to open avenues of thought and indeed hope for some of you. Now, yesterday I visited the 9/11 Memorial Garden. I slowly went round the pools, read some of the 3,000 names beautifully engraved in bronze. Around that large waterfall which cascades in a square form into an abyss, and then it moves into the center and it tumbles into an abyss and you cannot see where it goes. And it evoked in my mind powerful symbolism. My mind flashed back to 11 years ago as I watched in utter horror from my position in Germany at the time as the towers fell into the ground and that stream of dust and debris and twisted steel and humanity poured into the earth, never to return from it. And 9/11 is seared into all the memories of those old enough at the time to understand what was happening. A horrific, callous, evil act that brought grief and still brings it to thousands of families. Deprived thousands of their partners, their fathers, their mothers, their children, their relatives, their friends, their colleagues and their neighbours. It led to acts of memorable heroism. Who will ever forget the selfless actions of the New York firefighters and police? It was an attack upon a nation, and its sheer magnitude has made it difficult to process for many people, especially maybe some of you who do not really remember it. 9/11 raises in an acute form the problem of evil. And I've received a number of questions, as you've heard, from Columbia students. And the most prominent among them is the word why. And some say 9/11 shows, if we needed to be shown, that there is no God. But I did something else today. I switched on the television channel and watched for several hours and listened to the names of the people being read out. Listened to relatives describe their love for their lost husband or wife or girlfriend or colleague. And I was struck, very struck, by the many clear assertions of faith in God and His love, and the hope that it gave to those left behind. In fact, what was particularly moving was that the people did not speak about their relatives and friends as if they no longer existed. They spoke not about them, but they spoke to them. I love you, Dad. That went to my heart as a dad. What must it be like to gaze at those holes in the ground and realize that your son was buried there and you will never see him again? But what was even more striking in this was that I didn't hear a single tinge of atheism from those who were immediately involved in suffering bereavement. Now, it may be that 9/11 has been eclipsed for many of you by more immediate problems than the suffering caused by terrorism. In a crowd like this, there will be many who are suffering their own private horror. Whether it's the horror inflicted on you by somebody else, or whether it's disease or illness or some natural catastrophe that fills your entire horizon. I can remember the day my brother was blown up by a terrorist bomb and nearly lost his life. I haven't had that experience myself, but I've been near to it. And those things are so real, because in the end, the suffering that we are most concerned with is our suffering and our pain. And it gets more remote as it fades into the past and is the suffering and pain of others. So this is what we call the problem of evil and suffering, and we all face it. And I'm a scientist, and I like to analyze things and take them to pieces and understand how they work. And there's been some very interesting work in psychiatry and psychology recently by Ian McGilchrist, arguing how the two sides of the human brain work. Now, this has been, in a sense, for years common knowledge, that the left side of the brain is concerned with analysis, concerned with reducing things, concerned with explanation, concerned with science. But McGilchrist's thesis is this: that human beings are so made from the perspective of science that they have two halves to their brain. And what we've done since the 17th century is to neglect the right side of the brain, which is concerned not with breaking down and reducing and analyzing, but concerned with integrating and finding meaning and discovering a big picture into which life fits. And that fascinates me because it's coming from a scientific discipline. It's saying that's the way we humans are. And so we are in peril if we simply concentrate on the side of scientific analysis. And that's why tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to be speaking in terms so much of scientific and forensic analysis. I want to address the right brain question. Why? How can we fit this into a worldview that makes sense, but above all gives us some kind of hope and perspective? Now, suffering comes to us from two logically distinct sources. The first is the moral evil for which men and women are themselves responsible, like 9/11. The second is the kind of suffering that doesn't come from human beings: natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, and cancer. And this is often called natural evil. So there are those two kinds. They're often entwined, and they very much belong together in our consideration. At the intellectual level, the most famous response to suffering comes from David Hume, the philosopher. Epicurus's questions are yet unanswered, he writes. Is he, God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil? I will never forget sitting talking to two Jewish acquaintances, and we started talking about God, and before I'd gone very far they said, look, just stop a minute, we don't believe in God. And there's no point in talking about God to us. And I said, why? And they said, we don't want to tell you, because you seem a nice chap and we don't want to offend you. Well, I said, I may or may not be a nice chap, but if my faith cannot meet objections and difficulties, it's not worth believing in. Why don't you believe in God? And eventually they told me, they said they read out loud together, and they were reading a book by a famous Nobel Prize-winning literature Bolshevik singer who wrote a book called The Slave. And in it he described how some women and children were buried alive in a Russian pogrom. And I think it's in the book, it says, I can forgive God anything but not that. And they said at that moment the light went out. There was no God, and we haven't believed in him since. I've stood in Auschwitz many times, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm not ashamed to tell you I have wept every time as I saw the horror of the Holocaust and what it left. Now, to many people, when they see 9/11, when they see the Holocaust, when they see their own personal suffering, they say, well, there isn't any God, and that's it, that's the finish. And it seems to them that they've got rid of the problem. But does atheism get rid of the problem? Let's just think about that for a moment. I was in New York just 3 weeks ago to appear on the Charlie Rose Show, of which some of you may have heard. It will be aired next week, I think, with Richard Dawkins, the world's most famous atheist, whom I've debated 3 times before. Now, here is his left-brained analysis of the question of suffering and evil. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe has exactly those properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Were the suicide bombers of 9/11, were the architects of the killing fields of Cambodia and in Rwanda simply dancing to the music of their DNA? Is that all there is to the massacres of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and Pol Pot? And if you felt like cutting babies to pieces for fun, would that simply be dancing to your DNA? If Dawkins is right, ladies and gentlemen, then evil and good do not exist, which strikes me as being very odd for a man who will condemn 9/11 and everything else as being evil, and quite rightly so. But he himself appears to believe that there is no such thing. This is one extreme atheistic response to the problem. It's essentially to deny that there's any good or any evil. We are simply robots, pre-programmed to follow our genetic inclinations. But Dawkins, like the rest of us, is outraged by evil in spite of his philosophy. But outrage, which we often rightly feel, presupposes that there exists a standard of good that is objectively real and independent of us, so that we expect others to agree with us in condemning things like 9/11. But if all that exists is mass energy, if there is no transcendence and no God, how can there be such a standard of good? And if there is no moral evil or good in any case, the concept of morality disappears and moral outrage is absurd. Many leading thinkers agree with this. Charles Taylor, the leading thinker about secularism says the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. The irony, to my mind, is the very morality that atheists use to condemn 9/11 is in the Bible itself. And Thomas Jefferson recognized this. God who gave us life gave us liberty, he said. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God? I would like to suggest to you, if for whatever reason we lose faith in God, our future is bleak, because we will not be able to defend the freedoms we value on the basis of the moral relativism that remains when we lose our anchor in God. No secular morality was able to withstand Stalin, Hitler, or Mao, and no secular morality will withstand secularism or religious fanaticism today. Friedrich Nietzsche saw more clearly than anybody else the consequences of abandoning traditional biblical morality that is at the heart of our Western civilization and on which all our human rights conceptions and legislations are based. Nietzsche predicted that the death of God would lead to a Darwinian imperative of expressing the will to power. The strong must eliminate the weak. The biblical prohibition, thou shalt not kill, he wrote, is a piece of naivete. Life itself recognizes no solidarity, no equal rights between the healthy and the degenerate parts of an organism. One must excise the latter, or the whole will perish. Nietzsche despised Christian morality as that of slaves, and pointed out the death of God would mean the death of compassion, kindness, and forgiveness. When one gives up Christian belief, he wrote, one deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendental. It possesses truth only if God is truth. It stands or falls with the belief in God. And then he asked the key question, why morality at all, when life, nature, history are non-moral? And yet there is morality. Absolute standards exist. I dare say and hope that all of us agree that torturing infants is wrong. And the prominent atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie says ethics constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. If then there are such moral values, they make, listen to this now, this is an atheist philosopher. If moral values exist, they make the existence of God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus we have, after all, a defensible argument from the existence of morality to the existence of God. So the situation looks to me like this. We all find ourselves to be moral beings. We're outraged by 9/11. We're outraged by things that happen to us and to our friends. The existence of such objective standards is consistent with the existence of God and very difficult to explain without him. But the existence of God gives rise to the problem of evil. And some of you might want to break in and say, but look, isn't it obvious that God's part of the problem, not the solution? I hear from your accent that you're from Northern Ireland. Doesn't Northern Ireland give the lie to any possibility of God helping us in this problem? Look at you, fighting in the name of God against each other. I admit I do come from Northern Ireland. What do I say to the fact that professing Christians in my own country have got involved in terrorism so that even my own brother was nearly blown into eternity? Do you know what I say about it, ladies and gentlemen? I am completely ashamed of it. Utterly ashamed that the name of Jesus Christ has ever been associated with violence. But I want to tell you why I'm ashamed of it. Because people that take up weapons to follow Jesus Christ are not obeying him, they're disobeying him. He explicitly told his followers not to fight. And he told Pilate, the Roman governor, when he was put on trial for what? It may interest you to know, if you don't know the history, that Jesus was tried for fomenting political terrorism. And when Pilate discovered and listened to Jesus say, "My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting," Pilate realized that he was innocent. What was his kingdom about? It wasn't about fighting. "To this end I was born," he said, "and to this end I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth." And Pilate then knew that there was no danger, political or violence-wise, from this man. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it must be obvious to you that the one thing you cannot do by violence is to impose truth, especially if that truth conveys the way in which people can be forgiven and have peace with God and enjoy a very close and intimate relationship with God. Now, of course, other religions must speak for themselves in this matter of violence. I come from Ireland. I am a Christian, so I face it from this perspective. But there is another side to this, ladies and gentlemen. You've all heard the song that people like to sing, and Dawkins quotes it, by John Lennon. "Imagine a world with no Taliban. Imagine a world with no religion, with no Northern Ireland." I don't know how people can imagine a world without Northern Ireland, but there we are. Imagine that world, and I agree with a lot of its sentiments. But I notice that what Dawkins does not say is imagine a world without Stalin. Imagine a world without Hitler. Imagine a world without Pol Pot, the leaders of 3 militantly atheistic regimes. There is no excuse for 1 litre of blood that flowed in the name of religion in history. But the millions of litres of blood that have flowed in the name of secularist atheist ideologies beggar description. Alexander Solzhenitsyn stood in this country years ago, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, "If you asked me what was it that led to 60 million of my fellow citizens dying, he said, the answer is this: we have forgotten God." And many a Russian, because I spent a lot of time there, has said to me, "Do you know, Professor Lennox, we thought that we could get rid of God and preserve a value for human beings. We found we couldn't." And so in this contemporary secular society, we need to think about these things. But it's just at this point that atheism, that worldview, seems to me to face another great difficulty, the problem of justice. We all feel that we should get justice, but the fact is not everybody does. Indeed, for over the centuries, probably most people have never got justice. And in the atheist worldview, death is the end, so they will never get justice. The promised utopia has never come. And that is one of the factors to put into the equation. How can you possibly believe in justice in the light of the fact that the vast majority of people will never get justice? And of course, the terrorists get away with it. When Hitler sees he's against a wall, he blows his brains out. And since there is no justice, there is no judgment, there is no assessment, because death ends everything, he's got away with it. That is a moral affront to our being and our moral sense. So what I want to say to you tonight is this: that biblical monotheism, shared at this level by the 3 great monotheistic religions, says the exact opposite. It says, yes, there are absolute values. There is a moral law, but there is a lawgiver. God is behind the law, and he will be his vindicator, because there will be a final judgment when perfect justice will be done. Now, this is not the justice of an angry God. I'm amazed that I meet so many people that think that God is angry. Listen, God created you with all your wonderful gifts of artistry. He painted the universe. The only thing that gets God angry is the thing that destroys life. Let's call it by its name, it's sin. But God painted all the colors. We've never invented a new one. And we need to get away from this picture. It's precisely because God is a God of love, who loves the creatures he created, that in the end he must do justice, that we may see that justice is being done and that it is not a mockery. and that our intuitions and consciences actually are backed up by something real. Now, many people reject the notion of judgment. I don't like a God like that, they say to me. But then they protest at moral evil and say, why doesn't God stop that? That's very interesting. Why doesn't he stop that so long as he doesn't intervene in my life? But you know, none of us can realistically discuss this problem without realizing that we're not just spectators of a phenomenon extraneous to ourselves. G.K. Chesterton, the famous novelist, was once asked to reply to the London Times to answer the question, what is wrong with the world? And his famous reply was the shortest letter in history. Dear sir, I am, yours faithfully, G.K. Chesterton. He was honestly prepared to say openly what we all know in our heart. There's evil in each one of us. We're part of the problem. And once we grasp this fact, a more realistic formulation would be, I think and do evil. If then there is a God, why does he tolerate me? Now the questions come thick and fast. Why does God allow suffering if there is a God? Surely if he's all-powerful, he could have created us without the capacity for moral evil. Well, of course he could. God could have made beings without the capacity for moral evil. In fact, there are a huge lot of them. They're animals. We can create beings that don't do evil. They're robots. But they're not human beings. I'm glad I do not have a robotic wife. If I went home and pressed the screen and it came up on my wife's, in front here, the screen came up with press number 1 for kiss. I press number 1 and I get a kiss. Well, that would not be meaningful, would it? But she wouldn't sin. She'd never do anything wrong. But she couldn't love me. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, this capacity to do evil is the flip side of the capacity to do good. And that is associated with the capacity to love, to say yes or no. It's associated with one of the most magnificent things about us, and that is the fact we possess, to a certain degree, freedom of will and choice. And if free will is real, as I believe it is, and most of us do, the last thing we like to be told is, you did that because you're an Irishman, or whatever it is. You're a woman, you're a man. No, we like to think we did it because we chose to do it. In other words, our dignity, our humanity consists in that succession of choices that we have made and still make that makes us us. This is, to my mind, a magnificent gift of God. But it has correlatives. As C.S. Lewis pointed out, if God created the world so that a beam of wood remained solid when I used it to build a house and bent in two when I used it to hit you, it would in the end render choice impossible. We would be forced into an automatic universe. Evil thoughts, he says, would be impossible, for the cerebral matter of our brain would refuse to carry them. It would only convey good thoughts, and so on. So God took a risk. Let's face it. God took a risk in creating such beings. I've got 3 children. I took a risk in bringing them into the world, didn't I? I remember holding the first child and thinking, this child could grow up to love me or say no to me. I brought it into the world. Why did I take the risk? Aren't you glad somebody brought you into the world? Now, your experience of parental love may be very different. But it is an amazing thing that even though we know as parents there's a possibility of it going wrong, we still open ourselves up to love. We do that in all of our relationships. But you say, look, that argument of free will doesn't apply to natural disasters. I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake, and if you want to see what I said, the many TV and radio interviews, you can Google my name in New Zealand under the word earthquake, and you will find out. But I just want to say this. It's a very strange situation, because tectonic plates that are responsible for earthquakes are essential to life. If there were no tectonic plates, you would not be alive, because there wouldn't be enough carbon dioxide, and a lot of various processes that happen in the world would not occur. So on the one hand, they're necessary for life, but on the other hand, they destroy life if we build houses above them. Earthquakes are big things, but they're little earthquakes. 4 years ago, I had an earthquake in my heart. I was given a few minutes to live. That concentrates your mind. I said goodbye to my wife. I thought I'd never see her again when the operating theatre closed. And 40 minutes later, the surgeon said, well, I don't understand it, you should be dead. But you're not, you can go home tomorrow. And I'm here. And you say, well, you're a Christian, you thank God for that. Yes, I do, but listen. In the very same year, my 22-year-old niece had an earthquake in her brain. And it killed her. And her young husband watched her die. And I had to come and watch her die and talk to them. All very well, isn't it? For me to say, yes, God help you. But if I had nothing to say to my sister, then I'd better keep quiet, hadn't I? And that seems to me, and forgive me for being personal, but these things are personal and real. They give rise to questions like this. Could God have made electricity that wasn't dangerous? Could he have made fire that didn't burn? Could he have made a world without tectonic plates, without predation, without bacteria? Could God, should God, would he, could he, possibly, should he? And we can go on forever, and we have done, haven't we? What do I do with questions like that? I have no ultimate answers, so I think of another question. And the other question is this. Whatever we go to along arguments like that, the fact is we live in a mixed world. We live in a world where we see wonderful flashes of good and kindness and friendship and compassion, even in the horror of a 9/11. But we see other things that go beyond. They're so excessive. By the time I'm finished this lecture, how many thousand children will have died from preventable diseases, but they had no medicines because they couldn't afford it? And that gives us a sense of proportion. So my question to you, and I'm coming to the end of my talk, ladies and gentlemen, is this. We can argue from now for years on what a good God could, should, would, might have done. But there's another question we can ask. Granted the universe is like this. There is good, there is evil, there is pain, there is beauty, there is hatred, there is love. Is there any evidence anywhere in the midst of it all that there is a God who can be trusted with it? Has God made provision big enough to cope with the fact that humans have gone their own way? I spoke to you that there's going to be a judgment. I'm going to have to face that judgment. It's not something we like to talk about. But that's because we don't see it in its true context. Who's going to be the judge? Now here I must speak as a Christian. One of the opportunities is in universities to listen to other worldviews. Please do. But I'm going to try to explain to you how Christianity copes with this. At least it's worth listening to, because atheism has no way out. You may think it's right or it's wrong, but at least listen to it and assess it. The heart of Christianity is a cross. And if Jesus is who he claimed to be, God become human, and now that goes way beyond our thinking. But I've written a great deal about those questions elsewhere, but just come to the central thing. Just imagine with me, if you can for a moment. The claim is that God suffered. That's spectacular, because do you know what it tells me? It tells me that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. I find that a little window that begins to open on a whole world of possibilities for meaning in my little life. Because the claim goes on to suggest that he suffered for me, who've made a mess of my life, who've got all these hurts and these pains, so sometimes, as some of our students sadly do, we commit suicide. Because it becomes too much, there's no way out, there's no source of meaning. Listen, ladies and gentlemen. Think this through. There is a source. of deep and satisfying meaning, because the death of Christ was not the end. He rose from the dead. I believe that as a scientist. Miracles of this kind do not violate the laws of nature, because Jesus did not rise by natural processes occurring in his tomb 5 minutes before it occurred. He was raised by the very power of God. And that's what gives me hope. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I believe this is a moral universe. And people who suffered innocently will not perish for that ultimately. I'm going to say this, and please understand it comes from my heart. I really do believe that if I could see what God has done with people who've suffered innocently in natural disasters or under horrible moral evil, if I could see now what God has done with them, instead of having questions, I'd probably bow my head and worship. I believe that with all my heart. Otherwise, I wouldn't stand here for 1 minute. What am I saying? I believe that ultimately God knows how to compensate. Not find any of that in atheism. Is that pie in the sky when we die? Well, you'll have to decide that. What is the evidence? And you know, when we're really hurting, we need something to hold on to. I remember speaking to a man who was 7 years in solitary confinement in China for his faith. I said, "What kept you sane?" He said, "A sparrow that flew in through the grating of my prison cell high up," because he said, "I could see at least it was real and beautiful." And he said, "It held my faith in God for all those years that I was there." And so, as I listened to the names being read, and was moved myself to tears listening to a girl say, "Dad, you're my hero, happy birthday," on the birthday of her dad on 9/11. I thought, yes. All those people who read, almost all of them as far as I could see, burning in their hearts, was what resonates in the human soul. There's got to be hope somewhere. And there's hope in God. But then your university motto says it all. In tue lumine, videbimus lumen is the Latin version of it, by the way. In your light we shall see light. Do you know where that comes from? Listen. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light, Columbia University, in your light do we see light. And in the New Testament there is a very similar thing. When the Apostle Paul, who suffered greatly for his faith, is encouraging others, he says, "Look, share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began, and which now has been manifested through the appearing of our Saviour Jesus Christ." Now listen to this. "Who abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel." On 9/11, ladies and gentlemen, let us determine that this year we are going to begin the search under the motto that led the people who set up this university to found it. Thank you very much indeed.